people think about the design of the system, the coding of the system. They don't think about the time spent debugging, and the time spent debugging has to be taken into account when you're estimating how long a project is going to take. And basically, he said it's going to take 50% of the time. In fallacies of software engineering, the conclusion is it's about 40% of the time. I don't know how much that represents the Ruby community. I don't know how much that represents the programming community in general. But it's in the time that this was written, in the context that they were writing about, I don't really doubt those numbers. So I did find that there were specific actionable steps to shorten the gap between, or to reduce the amount of bugs that you introduce into the system, which means that you have to do less debugging overall. So basically it was about making small changes, writing code that's easier to reason about, keeping a mental model of the problem, making abstract concepts concrete, and a dedication to continuous learning. Okay, so making small changes. I'm not going to get into agile development overall, but the things that really, because there's a lot to it, and this talk isn't really about agile. It's about reducing the amount of time you have to spend debugging. But for me, what it has meant is that as a single developer, I'm the only person on this project right now. I'm the only person who both introduces and removes bugs from the system. And before, in previous projects, my experience was that I would make very, very, very quick progress. But every once in a while, I'd introduce some horrendous show-stopping bug that would take me a long time to figure out and remove from the system. And it would halt my forward progress. But because we are practicing Agile, we're making small bits of work and small changes to the system. The amount of things that can go wrong are reduced. And also, it means that I'm always making progress. And I don't find myself, in this constant frustration, battling my code, because I've taken steps to just work smarter. I also just don't have anybody to ask. If something goes wrong, it's on me to figure it out. And if I can make the code easier to reason about, easier to work with, that's a win. That's a complete win. Okay, so how do you make code that's easy to reason about? Okay, so the first step was, obviously for me, the 3 months that I spent pair programming with the other developers. This meant that, I was surprised how much we learned from each other. Because even though the guys I was working with were senior developers, they'd been working at it for a very long time, there were still, gaps in understanding. And when one person gets stuck, another person can fill in those gaps in understanding. But also, even I, as a junior or someone who is not as senior, I can still spot errors in logic and in syntax. And it really just helps to have someone looking over your shoulder to say, hey, is that right? That doesn't look right. Can you explain it to me? And as you're forced to explain the code to somebody else, you take it out of this abstract world and make it a little bit more concrete. You have to actually explain it well enough or understand it well enough to explain it to somebody else so that they understand what's going on. And there were a lot of benefits that we got from pair programming. We would catch each other's bugs. There was I there I benefited from learning from my colleagues, and it also meant that someone always has context to whatever code that you're working with, and that became important because we lost a person, and we could continue working. There was no slowdown because somebody else always had context. Okay. Another thing that I have done to help write better code that's easier to reason about is, read some classic books. And, these books are old, but the knowledge that's held in these are still valid. And every once in a while I'll go back and reread a section or pick up these other books that are also classics. And when you're talking about code styling, how to name your classes and your variables, that stuff lasts for a while, and it's knowledge that you can carry with you, whether you're programming in Ruby or you switch to Python or whatever else you go on and do. It's knowledge that that's gonna be valuable, and it's gonna make your code better. So yeah, I recommend these two books, Code Complete and Clean Code, and these are great books to read as well, The Pragmatic Programmer and Design Patterns. But the one I really want to talk about is this book on refactoring, because this one has helped me most recently, because there are tools in your editor that can help you integrate with, say, like Rubocop or Reek or some other tools that help you identify areas in your code that might be improved. But using those tools on their own, I didn't quite understand how to fix the errors or deal with the problems that the tools were telling me were a problem. But those tools will spit out things straight out of this book. And you can use this as a guide to help you in this virtuous cycle of, okay, my code editor is telling me that there's a problem here. How do I fix this problem? And then you can read. There are resources where you can read about how those problems are fixed generally. So I really like that book for that. So TDD. I was going to talk about this, but I'm just going to skip this slide for now. I'm not sure it's really relevant at this point to explain TDD. We might, if I have time, I might go through an example later. Okay, but I'm not an evangelist for TDD. And in fact, I tried TDD years previous, and within 2 weeks, I gave up on it. And it was because it slows me. It really does slow me down, and it takes more time to write the code that for the test than it does sometimes to write the code that works for your feature. And then tests break all the time, and it's such a pain when tests break. But when I was working with these other developers, I mean, the practice of TDD was enforced, and that was just how we all did it. And in the short term, I found it to drag. But in the long term, it meant that we always made forward progress. And so even though it bugs me to use TDD, and it's really annoying, I use it because it in the long term, it really helps. And you know, the part of the reason it helps isn't things I've heard before. Like, part of the reason it helped for me is that it forced me to maintain a mental model, and not just maintain a mental model of what was going on in the code. It forced me to prove it. Because I can say, oh yeah, I understand this code. But if I write an expectation that fails, and that happens all the time, all of a sudden I have proof that I am wrong, and that that mental model of the code that I had running in my head, all of a sudden I have to find the gap in understanding of the code that I wrote and how it's actually behaving. And so I really like it for keeping me honest about, do I really understand what's going on in this code? If I do, I can write assertions, and and the assertions will never be unexpected. But I write things that unexpectedly pass and unexpectedly fail all the time. So it's nice to have a mechanism for identifying and working with the code. And the thing is, like, the way I see TDD is sort of a debugger, but it's a debugger that happens that you have agency with, because you decide when you're going to work out the logic, or work out problems with the system. Because as you write your code, your code, the tests are going to fail, and that is a bug. And then you make those tests pass, and then you remove the bugs from the system. So I would rather do that work in advance than find out later, in production, that, oh, this business logic that I wrote doesn't really work the way that I thought it was going to work. So it's helped me a lot. And then rubber duck debugging. This actually, the way that I practice this, because I don't have other developers that I can talk to, and I don't talk to a rubber duck literally, but my manager doesn't really, he's not a coder. He doesn't really know. He doesn't know how HTML works. I mean, but he tells me, hey, there are bugs in this page. And when he and I talk about it, I literally go share my screen, and I'm very, very lucky to have the sort of relationship with my boss where I can tell him I'm wrong and I don't understand things, and talk through the problem with him. And there's a lot of times when he'll tell me, hey, this doesn't work. We'll go through it. Oh, Frank is showing a rubber duck. We'll go through it. And because he is so inexperienced with development, he is my literally, or I'm using him as my rubber duck. And there's many, many times when I'm trying to explain to him how the code works, that I understand. I have a light bulb moment. Oh, okay, this is what I have to change. And it really has helped me a lot. Okay, so The Mythical Man Month. This is the book that got me into programming. And I'll just read this quote. The programmer, like the poet, works only slightly removed from pure thought stuff. He builds his castles in the air, from air, creating by exertion of the imagination. Few media of creation are so flexible. so easy to polish and rework, so readily capable of realizing grand conceptual structures. And when I read this book like the first year that I was trying to program, and it was just magical. This idea that you can just think things, and through the exertion of thought, create things was magical. Now that I actually have to do it, it's it it makes it hard to create things, because because we work in a media that is so abstract that it's easy to lose your place, or it's easy not to understand how one thing relates to another, or how a system works, because it is so conceptual. So what I found is that you can do things to make what is abstract ideas more concrete. So you can use a REPL. A lot of times in my code, I'm coding and I don't really know if the code behaves the way I really think it does, and so I'll just test it out. So I'll either use IRB or Rails console. Sometimes I'll test things out in the Postgres console. I also work in the web console sometimes. And those are really, really useful tools to verify that how you think this behaves actually behaves, and it shortens the feedback loop, where you have this question of, I don't really know how, is this the right syntax for ranges, or is this wrong? Does three dots mean an inclusive range or an exclusive range? I don't remember, but it's very, very easy to just pull up a console and verify it. I also write things down a lot. I keep a notebook, a pen and paper, and I'm always I'm reminded of the story of the differences between NASA and the Soviet space program, where NASA spent millions of dollars developing a pen that would work in space, because in space there's no gravity, and the pens that they had wouldn't work. So they spent a lot of time and money developing a pen that would work in space, and the Soviets used pencils. So a lot of times when I could, oh, Dave is correcting me on that. Well, maybe that's urban legend, but I find that a lot of times just keeping a notebook and being able to refer to a notebook helps me, offload some of that mental overhead, and just refer to things, and also I can draw, I can make arrows, I can those ideas that were so ephemeris, I can just look at on a page, and it makes things easier to reason about. Okay, and then continuous learning. So there are, I'm constantly using help. So sometimes I forget, what, how to create a model, or the exact syntax, or the data types that I can use for that model. So, I'll just go in the console and Rails G model -help. And you can do that with so many things. The help system that's built into your command line tools is super useful. So that's one of the ways that I use to to understand how my tools work, or how to do things, basically. And then there's other ways to read the documentation. So I'll just point I'll just do an example of something here. So I have a plugin installed. So I can just say read line here, and this will do a web search for a cheat sheet for readline. And readline is something that is used in a lot of your tools. So if you pull up an IRB session, it's using readline. If you're working in Vim, in insert mode in Vim, that's readline. When you're in Rails console, that's readline. If you're using pry is using readline. And these shortcuts will work in all of those environments. So if you, let's say, start out typing some things, in theory, if you follow these shortcuts, Control A will take you back to the beginning, and it does. So I find that having tools integrated into my dev environment, and this is literally my dev environment here. I use Vim to code, but having those tools just readily available really helps. So if I'm going through the code and I'm having trouble and I need to reference, I've forgotten the how to create a circle in SVG. So I'll just try to pull it up. So DevDocs and then SVG, and then that'll open up a page for me to go to the documentation for SVG. So having those tools, all right, okay, so I can also either in a new console or either in a new console here, so I can do array. I can use the built-in documentation. RI is the sort of documentate the Ruby documentation. So I can come in here and figure out like, oh, this is how array works, and read more on it. I can also do that in my editor. So if I don't want to open up a new console, I can do the same thing. Yeah, it's in there. So, but it's sometimes it works better in a different console. Okay. Okay. The other thing that I found really helps keep my mental model of the problem solid is taking a break. And also, I mean, so a lot of times you'll be working through a problem and you'll just be banging your head against the wall, trying to figure out what's wrong. And if I do that for too long, I know that that's a signal for me to take a break and go for a walk. And a lot of times I'll find that, when I'm out and I'm distracted, I'm doing other things, my subconscious kicks in, and all of a sudden, hey, I have another thing I can try, or oh, I know what's wrong. It's because these two things aren't interacting well with each other. But so sometimes sometimes the solution is just to take a break and let your brain cool off and come back fresh, take another look at the problem. Sometimes it's difficult to proofread your own code because you've wrote it. You just wrote it 5 minutes ago. You know what it does. So you don't even process what's really written down. And then you go for a walk and you come back and you reread your code and you actually do some proofreading because you've created distance between the person who wrote it and the person who's reading it. And all of a sudden you say, oh, there's a syntax error. and it helps taking that time, taking a break helps you look at your code with fresh eyes. Okay. I don't know if I'm going to. How much time do I have, Frank? Okay, great. Okay, so okay, great. So these are debugging tools that mostly you see in your front end code, and I used to use these tools a lot. Web console, basically, you put this statement into your views, and at the bottom of each of your views, you're going to have a console that you can interact with, and that you can see the state of different variables and play around and inspect your code that way. And better errors just presents a better view of the error that you're getting, and also I think it also provides a console. These are tools I don't use anymore, and I don't use these anymore because I'm never looking at my console as much. I'm not looking at my console as much because what I do is basically uh, uh, practice test-driven development. And once I have used test-driven development to create all my features, at that point, I start looking at the front end to see what's actually there and to verify that what I'm creating is actually there. And it was a huge shift because and this is a technique that I picked up with VMware, because we'd be working on developing a feature for a whole day, and for the whole day we wouldn't even refresh the page, which was amazing to me and a little disconcerting. But once I got into the habit of writing the code first and then focusing on the front end view, it took away a lot of the distractions, which was this focusing on, I guess it would have been bug-driven development, because without test-driven development, what I was doing was not doing any testing at first. I would create the feature, refresh the page, find an error. And then I go back and rewrite it and refresh the page. There's another error. And then go back and rewrite it. And so more or less it was bug-driven development. I mean, things were breaking all the time. And sometimes it was frustrating and hard to track down. And I'm glad I don't do it anymore. Okay, so some of the tools available for you to work with. Pry, Bybug, there's a new, in Rails 7, Bybug has been replaced with the debug gem. And these are the ways that you basically help the debugger know when to stop. You place one of these lines into your code, and your debugger will stop at that point. Okay. It's every once in a while I will also have to be working with a different library, a different gem, and sometimes that gem is either causing problems or working in a way that is completely unexpected. And when that happens, you can open up the source code and look in that source code and actually see what it's doing. So that's one of the other techniques to figuring out, like, if it's not your code that's causing the problem, or if it's a lack of understanding of the external library, then just read the external library or go to the GitHub page for that external library. Other people might have, a lot of times people will just Google errors. And that's great. Sometimes you find good results in Google searches. But if you're having problems with a specific library, one of the things that you can do is go to the GitHub page for that library. Look through the issue codes, look through the GitHub issues, and look for your errors there. And some it helps a lot. Okay. And that is the end of my presentation. It was a very strict TDD shop, very strict Agile, very strict TDD. Well, you can't be strict Agile, but they practiced Agile methodology and TDD.
Yeah. I have a weird take on TDD. I think TDD is great if you have a well-covered application. So if your automated tests pretty much cover most of the app, then TDD, when fixing bugs, is a great methodology. But if you're developing new features, I don't think TDD is the best route. Usually I like to architect it out on a pen, on pen and paper, how I'm going to lay out this functionality or feature, the moving parts. And then I'll start coding, but then write tests as far as the final commit for that feature. So just a different take. But.
Well, I think it depends on how in depth you get into the advocacy behind TDD. But I don't want to derail this Q&A session onto that rabbit trail. But awesome. Thanks, Nelson. Thanks, Dave. Does anyone else have questions for Nelson?
Yeah. About the book, I read it a long time ago. It's pretty amazing. And what's the most amazing, I was reading it and I looked and it was written 80s. And I'm like, this is crazy because it sounds like it was written yesterday. And what it means is, like, in 30 years, despite all these books,
nothing is new under the sun.
Changed. Like, it's the same problems.
Yeah.
So my question is, how is that we have so many books explaining how to do something in a better way? And book is mostly about business processes around software engineering. Like, how in 30 years we have the same problems and we didn't move like even an inch from them? Like, what's your take on that?
I mean, part of it is that all this stuff is so conceptual that it's difficult to it really is about understanding how faulty the human brain is and how hard it is for humans to think like computers. And so a lot of what's in those books are understanding how difficult that journey is, and taking steps that that recognize, oh, okay, this is common things that happen to everybody, and it's it's hard to say like if the practices that we have today are better than the practices we had yesterday, because we have different tools, we have different programming languages, we have have different frameworks, but ultimately we're still just human beings trying to translate abstract ideas into something that a machine will understand.
On time, on budget, and with a satisfactory result, and driven by the need to communicate with other stakeholders and work within a human organization. I wanted to add that other part because I think I didn't want to take away from what you were saying, Nelson, but
Yeah.
I think driving home, the root cause of these well-trodden problems is not the technology, it's the total holistic environment, people-oriented environment in which software development happens.
Yeah, and I mean, I also think that people, you know, when I see a lot of videos, it's about TDD or this. It's people evangelizing those tools and saying, "Oh, the tools are the solution." The tools are tools; they're not the solution. Agile is not, or you know, a lot of these processes are not useful unless you see them as tools, apply them when necessary, and try out different tools that work for you. And sometimes the tools that work for you when you start out will not be the same tools that work for you when you're 40 years into your journey.
As someone who just turned 40, that's profound. I got another 10 years. Thanks, Nelson. Anyone else have any other questions? And that was a really good one, Max.
I'm still going to double down on my puts debugging techniques. But no, I really like your
100%,
presentation.
Dave. 100%.
At first, I mean, honestly, I thought it was going to be like a complete bashing session the whole time, but you definitely went in a different direction than I initially thought. It was good. And I think you hit on so many good points about writing clean code. If your code is clean, then it will be easier to debug. You won't have to do puts debugging a lot of times because you can clearly see where things are at. And I think a lot of times the books from Sandy Metz are really good on their object-oriented programming and just kind of the Sandy Metz laws of keeping your methods really short. I really kind of see them more as a rule. I don't follow those to the T, but I do keep my methods really short, especially if I'm creating some kind of service object or some kind of just plain old Ruby object. I try to have only one entry point into them. And then that main entry point, I almost do pseudo programming where I type out the name of what I want this thing to do, like verify that a user exists and that kind of stuff. And then those are private methods within that class. So when you first come in there, you're not having to spend all day trying to figure out what in the world is this class actually doing. You can read in relative plain English what it's doing and then go and find and debug those specific methods that are causing the problem.
Do you find that you do a lot of debugging, or has it declined over the years as you gain more experience? Is it pretty static?
So the main application I work on is a hybrid application. It uses Rails, Padrino, and Sinatra kind of all combined. And it's over 14 million lines of code. So I still do a crap ton of debugging every day. Because
Yeah.
there's always something new that's getting uncovered. So
I'll say in my experience, I don't know that I do less debugging. I think I've become better at knowing what the final like fix will be, just from like having done it so many times, having so many reps. And I think I'm also better at the process of debugging, like quickly knowing, okay, I can look here and then I can look here rather than kind of finding my way through the dark. You know, I don't know that I kind of, you know, one of your first slides was, you know, your experience, you know, the expected experience was like, I don't know if I'm doing it the right direction, kind of slowly down over time versus you said yours was pretty static and then a significant drop after time. I don't know that mine has dropped as much as it has. I guess you could call it time to recover has been has been much improved over time. I don't know if that's anyone else's experience.
yeah,
I
we
would
become more
say,
familiar.
and I would go camera on, except apparently OBS, which finally started working and stealing my webcam from the browser. I want to add a little, as someone who has hired and worked with developers of various skill levels, from people who are pretty good to early in career boot camp grad style things. One thing I will notice, the absolute best debugger I have ever worked with in my entire career was a 12-year-old genius who's a good friend of mine. He's now in his 30s. When we worked together back then, I have had highly paid college degree boot camp career switching graduates who everything on paper says they should be good with this can't debug their way out of a bag. Like if it doesn't work, they just hit a brick wall if Stack Overflow doesn't give them an answer. And I'm not picking on someone in particular. I'm generalizing. Now, 12-year-old's true. His name is Jonathan, and he's also my only friend who has a private plane and plays pedal steel guitar and project manages like healthcare IT systems today. But so I would say that debugging can be learned. It's a skill. Some people can have it innately, but it is very possible to be a developer and to be, you know, really low ability to do a debugging process. So there's something there that is either you figured it out because you can connect dots, or you have to learn a process to be good at it. Like something went wrong. Why? Like the way I like to think about it in general, and I'm not sure how you teach this yet, is okay, I have observed this phenomenon with the system. Based upon my knowledge, experience, and whatever, what is a short list of theories about what might be going on under the hood that is causing that? And then work kind of the scientific method to eliminate candidate theories until you arrive at what it really is.
I have a very anti-scientific take on it. I was thinking about it for a while. Sometimes people ask me to look at a problem and I just guess what's the answer, and quite often I'm right. It lies down in intuition. First of all, it comes with experience. Your subconscious can calculate way faster. All great mathematicians, they don't sit and recall whatever they learned 10 years ago. They just snaps in their head and then immediately know, in many cases, approach to complicated problem just from their experience. So a lot of years of experience just doing something without even any special approaches and eliminations gives a huge advantage. And second, just trusting the intuition. A lot of people, they try to be, I think, very precise instead of just let's try a couple of things. Let's try my top 3 guesses what might be wrong, completely out of blind, like not putting any debugging messages like, what if I replace that if statement right here? And surprisingly, with experience, you'll be guessing pretty good. So I think that's something that I started to pay quite a lot of attention to.
Well, TDD helped me get more experience, because when you see those error messages pop up, you write a little bit of code, you see what error message you get. All of a sudden, now instead of in a week, I see a certain number of error messages. Now every hour, I'm seeing the same number of error messages because I'm doing TDD and figuring out like, oh, this is a simple problem to fix, because I just wrote the code that made this fail in this way. And so the scope that I had to work with was a lot smaller, and so the problems were all easier to fix, and it helped me see a lot more error messages and get that intuition that you get for you talk about experience, like, how do I get that experience faster? Well, I can do TDD and I see more error messages and I get experience debugging a lot more often, because it's just a shortened cycle of doing all of that.
Yeah, exactly. And doing is a big part of it. Quite often people looking for a solution, and solution sometimes is sitting and doing something for a very long time, like years, and that's the solution. So it's not sometimes what people want to hear, and they want complicated methodologies that will solve their problem, but sometimes the answer is just you sitting and do it for a very long time, and then you just become good at that.
Well, I mean, I think there's value to what you're saying, but I do respectfully disagree, if only because intuition is, while extremely valuable, is not something we can reliably teach others how to do. Like, it's something you develop over
You
time.
cannot teach it; it just comes. And some people don't even trust it when they have experience. So yeah, you cannot teach it.
So having a method,
debugging.
right?
This has been my most effective way of problem solving, is to audibly talk it out, because if I can speak it out vocally, then that brings a different level of awareness to the problem for me. Because if I am not able to understand myself explaining the issue, then I don't understand the issue. I don't understand the bug or whatever the situation is. So having a clear understanding of the problem, because all debugging really is the pursuit of trying to find the root cause of a problem. And if we can't identify what the problem is, then we can't find a root cause. And then in the application that I work on that has millions of lines of code, it's a nightmare. 98% of it was written by other people, and they have all since gone and left, and there was zero turnover of the code to our current team. And so they were heavily relying on callbacks. So each model in the application has 10, 15 different callbacks, and those have callbacks whenever they're modified and stuff. So actually tracing back an issue, it's extremely difficult, but that's where
I mean,
I find
it's almost like Schroeder. You're almost dealing with probabilities at that point. Like,
yeah,
not quite. It is still deterministic, but it's hard to understand the chain of events.
Yep. So that's where I will first off go through the application where I'm seeing that it could potentially be, using the scientific method, as you say, Frank. And I'll go through and say puts, and then I will actually put like the file name and the line number where I'm actually putting in that debug. So I can see when I execute and replicate the problem, I actually see in my logs where it's actually hitting different parts of the application. And sometimes it's a race condition. I'm like, wait, this should not be executing before this other thing. That's the problem. So between that and using emojis in my puts debugging is awesome. I highly recommend emojis. It makes them just pop out in the logs.
Gotta love that UTF-8.
Yeah. I work in a team right now. One developer, he really likes emojis, and when you look at the log, the severity of error depends on how many fires in it. Yeah, it does stand out.
I got to also admit, emoji is also valid Ruby, so you can name a calendar object the calendar emoji character if you just really want to. Any other questions for Nelson?
This was my first talk.
It's an
my
excellent first talk.
Good job, Nelson.
Thanks.
I think you're natural. I mean, I'm sure you prepared quite a lot, but I mean, it went really well. You should do more of them over time.
Thanks.
Great job.
Hey, thank you.
Oh, you got a question from Joshua via text. He says, my mic isn't working, but could you elaborate on the title?
Sure. So what the title actually means is that, at least in my experience, for me, when I found myself reaching for a debugger when I first started, comparing that to now I have all these other tools that I can reach for. And so when I see that screen full of errors, that red text scrolling by, I, instead of reaching for a debugger immediately, instead of pulling up, by bug, I have all these other tools and techniques. One is like, do I really understand this problem? Do I need to do a little bit more research? What does it look like in Rails console? Like, if I do this in Rails console, do I get the expected output back? Maybe it's a syntax problem, or maybe it's something else. But the debugger is not the first tool I go to, and so it means that I debug less. Also, the best kind of debugging is preventing introducing bugs into your code to begin with. So if you're doing a lot of debugging and you have these show-stopping bugs that take days to figure out, then maybe it's time to look deeper at why your code is hard to reason about and why your code is hard to understand. Yeah.
Hey, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
I got fixed the mic. Okay, cool. I think all that makes sense in general, but I'm just struggling with the idea that debugging itself would be considered a code smell. And in some respects, I would actually consider TDD a debugging technique because it does not necessarily solve the bug that you just introduced, but it does help surface them faster. But you still have to go through the effort of resolving with whatever you just introduced as a bug is. Yeah,
I totally agree. It shoves the bugs up front instead of so you exercise the code enough up front so that you do your debugging up front, and then you avoid problems later on where you have surprises that you didn't consider. So yeah, I do agree with you. I think it's a type of debugging, but it's a debugging where you have agency, where you say, "Oh, I'm going to take the time up front to work out the problems," instead of when you refresh your page.
I personally found the title to be a bit of a tongue-in-cheek. He's kind of comparing. He's not making an absolute statement that all debugging all the time, but if you are dropping into the debugger all the time to work out basic stuff rather than having some other tools and techniques for quality, that's how I interpreted kind of the title after Nelson went in. But when I first saw it, I was like, oh, this could be a fun debate. But that's what I got out of this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I feel like it's more clickbaity.
Yeah.
It was a little bait and switch here. It's more like overusing any tool is a code smell, or just it's a bad technique in general. And overusing the debugger could be a sign that you need to change up your strategies.
Yeah. Or make your, add more tools to your toolbox.
For sure. Well, thank you, Nelson. I really appreciated your presentation, and thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Thanks.
Thanks.